It's Tuesday. It's the 10th of June. You're watching ARIRANG Korea's only global network. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Chang-keuk. President Park Geun-hye has tapped a career journalist to be her new prime minister and a career diplomat to head the National Intelligence Agency. Now, on this Tuesday, the presidential office announced that Moon Chang-keuk, the former editor-in-chief of the JoongAng Daily and head of the Korean News Editors Association, had been nominated as a new prime minister. The spokesperson said the nominee's integrity as a journalist was highly valued, as a new prime minister will lead the government's campaign to root out ill practices in Korean society. Now, current ambassador to Japan Lee Byung-kee was named to head the National Intelligence Service. His logic-based working style and deep understanding of intelligence and security at home and abroad were mentioned in the announcement. Now, Tuesday's nominations signal the reshuffling within the cabinet and the presidential office may soon follow. President Park has pledged sweeping reforms in the aftermath of April's ferry disaster in this country. Now, moving on, the trial began this Tuesday afternoon for the captain and other crew members of the Seoul ferry that sank in April, killing hundreds of passengers. The captain and 3 other members of the crew are facing charges of murder by willful negligence. Our Connie Kim has this report.
The 15 crew members of the ill-fated Seoul ferry are on trial this Tuesday for fleeing the sinking ship, leaving behind hundreds of passengers. Seoul captain Lee Jun-seok and 3 other senior crew members are charged with murder by willful negligence. The rest are charged with negligence that led to the death of hundreds of people. The crew among the first to get off the ferry are accused of making no attempt to rescue passengers. With most of the crew members partially admitting to negligence, the focus of the trial will be whether the 4 senior crew members will be found guilty of murder. On this first day of the trial at the Gwangju District Court, prosecutors and the defense lawyers will lay out their respective cases and apply for evidence to be submitted.
If the murder out of willful negligence is to be upheld, the causal relationship must be proved that passengers died because the crew members did not rescue them, although they were aware of the dangers of death the passengers faced.
The prosecution says they have secured video footage and communication logs between the ferry and the vessel control tower as evidence to back their charges. Of the 15 defendants, only 1 has managed to find a private attorney for defense. The others will be defended by government-arranged lawyers. The trial will be relayed to another courtroom through video streaming for relatives and others who could not make it to the courtroom. In the event that Tanon High School students who are victims of the ferry disaster testify, they will do so from that auxiliary courtroom. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
Now, with regard to the weeks-long manhunt for the owner of the sunken Seoul ferry, President Park Geun-hye just cannot understand why it is taking so long for authorities to capture the billionaire on the run. During a cabinet meeting today, the president urged the nation's prosecution and police to review their means to arrest Yu Byung-hun and to seek other ways of locating the fugitive. Humbly accepting the outcome of last week's local elections, the Korean leader said the government should do its best to eliminate ill practices in society to make Korea a safer place to live. Now, President Park added that a focus should now also be on reviving the economy, and this by encouraging consumers to start spending again. The Seoul ferry disaster is being blamed on a number of things, and one of which is the practice of collusive ties between the government and the industries they are meant to regulate. And while changes have been promised, they're being met with resistance from special interest groups. Our JoongAng Daily explains.
Retired bureaucrats in Korea have long enjoyed the luxury of finding employment in firms and organizations that have direct links to their former posts. President Park Geun-hye's first choice for new prime minister, An Dae-hee, ran into trouble for that very reason, withdrawing his nomination last month after it was revealed he made some $1.5 million as a lawyer in less than 6 months, after retiring as a former Supreme Court justice. President Park has vowed to end the era of cozy ties between bureaucrats and the industries and companies they regulate and has pledged reforms. But the changes are not coming easily. The revised Public Service Ethics Act of 2011 states that the government's Public Ethics Committee must screen any former high-ranking government official that wants to work at a company or public institution. But the act exempts lawyers, certified public accountants, and tax accountants from the screening process. There have been calls to close the loophole, but in a recent pre-announcement of revised legislation, the three groups are still exempt.
The government needs to submit the revised Public Service Ethics Act to the National Assembly so that we can deliberate on it and make changes to the necessary clauses.
Opposition party lawmakers on the Parliamentary Public Administration Committee say they have been trying to have the clause removed, only to be met with resistance from related interest groups. Although President Park had vocalized a strong will to end the close ties between the government and the industries they are meant to oversee, legislation that would impose greater restrictions on the practice remains in limbo. JoongAng, ARIRANG News.
When the latest news meets the latest business stories, we give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Business Today with Moon Chang-keuk. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
New evidence has emerged that shows that the Japanese government acknowledged decades ago that its claims to the Korea-controlled Dokdo Island were not worth taking to the International Court of Justice, as it is pushing to do now. Now, despite this, the current Abe administration in Japan continues to threaten to take the case to The Hague. Our Yudian has the details.
A secret government report dating back to 1962 shows Japan knew back then that its claim to the Korea-controlled Dokdo Island was not a case that could be brought to the International Court of Justice. In the report recently released by a civic group in Japan, Tokyo's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said the Dokdo issue cannot be categorized as an international dispute, as it arose before Japan announced its compulsory jurisdiction over the island in 1958. The document added that territorial disputes only apply between countries that claim compulsory jurisdiction, but since Korea did not, it said the Dokdo issue cannot be deemed a territorial dispute. The transcript of a closed-door meeting between the then director of the Central Intelligence Agency of Korea, Kim Jong-pil, and former Japanese Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda in 1952 has also been made public. Ikeda told Kim that the issue should be left alone, since Korea is effectively in control of Dokdo Island.
This document proves Japan is making its claim while it knew from the very beginning that it was completely unjust.
The civic group wants to bring lawsuits against the Japanese government to make public documents related to bilateral talks between Korea and Japan to bring light to historical facts. Yurian, ARIRANG News.
Now, the FIFA World Cup 2014 FIFA World Cup is just 3 days away, but the host country may not be so ready as mass protests and strikes are rocking the host nation of Brazil. Public workers have stormed off the job and citizens have been protesting about the vast sums of public money spent on the tournament. Meanwhile, the 5-day strike by metro workers have been called off for now, but seems likely that it would continue. Connie Lee has more.
In Brazil's biggest city of Sao Paulo, metro workers entered their 5th day of protest on Monday, even after a court ruled their strike illegal. Riot police armed with tear gas had to confront the striking workers, who have reduced their demands to a 12% pay raise, lower than the previous 35%. Major subway lines have been closed since last Thursday, causing chaos, traffic jams, and uncertainty just days before the World Cup.
I think it's wrong. This shows how Brazil is. We do not have organization. We don't have anything, no patience. This is a country that will host the World Cup. Congratulations.
The city's mayor says officials are making every effort to end the strike.
We are seeking the solution not just for the upcoming big event, but as a right of the workers of Sao Paulo to have a judicial decision fulfilled so that normalcy can return to the city.
Leading up to the World Cup, the metro strike is just the latest in a string of protests by public workers. In Rio de Janeiro, outside a World Cup media center, teachers protested and rallied. Using the backdrop of international attention and the tens of billions of dollars spent by Brazil's government on the tournament, public workers have been demanding large pay raises. Thousands of other city employees, including police and bus drivers in different host cities, have also gone on strike in the weeks leading up to the World Cup. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
Now let's move on to the realm of classical music. Violinist JoongAng is one of Korea's musical legends. And ARIRANG News cultural correspondent Park Geun-hye sat down to have a chat with her about her 5 decades in the classical music business.
Korean classical music legend JoongAng, who has been leading a successful career spanning nearly 50 years, recalls her first encounter with the violin.
What I loved about the violin when I started, when I was 6, was the freedom. I felt that the instrument was very intimate, and it also presented a voice. And so from then on, it became very pure fascination for me.
Since winning the Leventree competition in 1967 at the age of 19, she has become one of the world's first Asian classical musicians to reach star status on the global stage. She also shared part of her music career in the Chung Trio, along with her sister cellist Chung Myung-hwa and brother maestro conductor Chung Myung-hoon.
I had a very, very busy career. Until I had 2 children. I was very lucky to have this active career as a young performer.
She's been hailed by fans and music critics alike for her passionate yet delicate playing that could resonate with almost any period of classical music, from Bach and Beethoven to modern composers like Stravinsky. She says her Guarnerius violin, which she acquired in 1983, is her voice.
This instrument is so human. Once I've been in touch with Guarnerius, there is nothing that comes closer to my soul than this instrument.
In 2005, she suffered a finger injury. Thinking her violin playing days were over, she began teaching at Juilliard and co-directing the Great Mountains Music Festival. By 2010, her finger healed, allowing her to fully return to playing on international stages and in charity concerts, such as the one she will perform at the Seoul Arts Center this Friday.
I started as a dream of having a big solo career, but it's not a single voice I am looking for now. It is harmonious voice. Unless we care for each other and find the voice of each other and tune it together, we will not find the harmony.
In addition to her China tour in October, Chung will also play at the Royal Festival Hall in London on December 2nd, on the stage where her international career took off. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
Well, we knew of it all along. It's a chronic problem for this country, but now it's threatening to stunt the nation's economic recovery. It's the mounting household debt here in this country, and household loans exceeded to record levels in the month of April. That is. Now, the Bank of Korea said Tuesday that the figure stood at around $680 billion as of the end of the month, up nearly $5 billion from March. But the bank tempered concerns over the level of household debt, saying the rise stems from strong home transactions, which exceeded the 92,000 mark in April, up by around 3,000 from a month earlier. And more concerning news, the haves in this country are getting poorer by day. The wealth gap between the middle class and the poor has widened to nearly double the size it was 20 years ago. Statistics Korea said Tuesday that the nation's so-called relative poverty rate of households in Korea's urban areas stood at 14.5% last year. Now that means more than 1 out of every 10 city households earned less than half of what middle-income households earn each year. Now, back in 1993, the rate stood at around 8%, and then it had topped 10% after the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s and briefly peaked over 15% after the global financial crisis of 2009. Korea exported $14 billion worth of products related to information and communications technology in May. But that's a disappointing 7.5% decrease compared to the same period last year. Trade officials attribute the decline to there being fewer business days this past May and point out that the daily average of shipments was relatively consistent with the figures from last year. Exports of display panels, mobile handsets, and semiconductors to major trade partners like China and the U.S. edged down. And it is the first time in 14 months that ICT exports to China decreased. However, exports to the EU and Taiwan were up. And with an import volume of $6.8 billion, the surplus of the ICT sector last month was at $7.2 billion. Meanwhile, the Asia-Pacific region is expected to overtake Western Europe and North America in terms of private wealth by the end of 2018. Boston Consulting Group's annual report, Global Wealth 2014, shows the Asia-Pacific region, excluding Japan that is expected to outstrip Western Europe within this year. The report classifies private wealth as cash, deposits, and securities, but excludes real estate. The report also expects the Asia-Pacific region will record an average annual growth rate of more than 10% by 2018. Now, last year, the amount of financial wealth held by Asia-Pacific region hit around $37 trillion, up some 30% compared to the previous year. Globally, the amount recorded $152 trillion, up nearly 15% from the year before, thanks to favorable conditions in the global security market. Now, on a different note, Korean singer Psy is back, and has he done it again? Well, Gangnam Style obviously took the world by storm 2 summers ago, and his latest track, Hangover, has burst out of the gate since being released this week. Here's our Shin Se-min.
14 million viewers and counting. In less than 1 day, Psy's new music video, Hangover, has certainly garnered interest on YouTube. It features Psy and American hip-hop artist Snoop Dogg delving into Korea's unique drinking culture and shows them visiting a singing room, drinking hangover remedies, visiting a sauna, and of course, downing soju in beer. Any success with this video will be judged against the one that broke Psy out as an international star in 2012. Since it was released, Gangnam Style has racked up over 2 billion views on YouTube, earning the title as the most watched clip of all time on the video sharing site. According to the British magazine The Economist, the time spent by all of us watching that video could have been used for other pursuits. The time spent watching the 4-minute 12-second video over 2 billion times equals 140 million hours, or 16,000 years. Had Gangnam Style viewers not been watching the video, The Economist says they could have constructed 20 Empire State Buildings or built 3 ships. Will we be talking about Hangover in the same way in a few years? Only time will tell, but Psy isn't resting on his laurels. He will release another single called Daddy this summer. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
Now, there is no country on earth where women are paid as much as men. Yes, I myself was shocked at this finding, but that is the fact according to the International Labor Organization. But that's not all. Listen, the country with the widest gender pay gap among developed nations is none other than Korea. I think we need to delve into this issue. Our regular contributor, Dr. Kim Byung-kee, joins us live in the studio. Dr. Kim,
Let's cool down just a little
right,
bit.
Inexcusable on behalf of all female workers in this country. Newly released data out there on gender gap in pay do seem quite controversial.
Indeed, to say the least. And I have a lot of problem with this newly released data released by the National Assembly Research Service. Yes, the fact remains that Korea is the worst in terms of having the gap, gender gap in pay. However, though, there are several details that we need to go through. First of all, let's cover the numbers here. It shows, as it's shown and released by, once again, National Assembly Research Service, the gap is pretty big between Korea and the number 2 worst case, Japan here. And Korea, 39%. What it means is if average median men's, the income is 100, for instance, women is 61. So that's what that number is showing here. And the only problem, some of the problems that I see here, however, is it's as of year 2010. So it was about, how many years ago? About 5 years ago or so. So that's a little bit outdated. And there have been some criticism about this timing of the data itself. And National Assembly Research Service responded saying, well, of course there was the OECD-wide data year 2011, but number of countries was limited, 25 as opposed to 33 for this year 2010 data. So they had to release this new finding, so-called quote-unquote new finding, based on 2010 instead of 2011. 2011, actually, Korea number went down a little bit, 37.5%. Still, Korea is number 1 in terms of having the gap, gender gap, so-called, but it is improving. So what I'm saying here is that, okay, depending on where you look, the gap may be smaller, even though Korea remains at number 1, and that issue needs to be addressed. But in terms of how big this is, depends on where you see and which year you're looking at over the change over year or over time.
Right. Just one little question: why is it that 2010 data or even 2011 data is the latest finding? We're in 2014.
Right. This is OECD data, and usually we're talking about 25 or 33 different countries, depending on which is available. And countries are often very slow in offering their numbers. Korea has been pretty good in quickly producing these kind of numbers, but not all the members of OECD. So there has to be about year gap, or 2 or 3 years of gap here.
All right, understandable. Let's move on to the point you touched briefly upon. So the the gap is narrowing, right?
Right. Indeed. Let's bring up the next set of numbers that will show you interesting trend here in Korea. This is not from the National Assembly Research Service, but from the Ministry of Employment and Labor. Let's bring it up on the screen here. And it clearly tells us that gap is itself narrowing. We have more ways to go for sure. And maybe last year the gap was slightly increasing from the year before. But however, the challenge is being dealt with here. And that's an important point that we need to highlight. Situation is improving. And the way I see it, we need several more years to see, considerable improvement in the Korea situation. And once again, the fact remains, Korea is number 1 in terms of having the largest gap in terms of gender pay among the world's most developed economies.
Well, so with those points in mind, still the issue remains.
Right.
There is a considerable gender pay gap. Now, any structural reasons to explain this?
One of the key reasons is what I call dualism in Korea's labor market. Basically, we have a large segment of the labor market where usually male labor is well protected by the labor unions and their job is well protected and they are highly paid. But because of the segment that's costly in a way in terms of economic cost, we have another second part of the labor market which is entirely based on contract and then time hourly workers who are working based on this kind of like a temporary arrangements, and they are paid not well at all. And that segment is often predominantly occupied by the female labor force. So that's why, we of course have a glass ceiling, so-called, in terms of like female professionals not being able to move up as fast and not as high as they can. But that's one thing. But the big part of it, I think, is the dual structure of the labor market.
Right. I mean, I think we recently we went over this the latest data that there are one of the fewest CEOs or politicians who are females here in this country compared to other countries across the globe. So there remains that glass ceiling and as well as the dual the dual system that you were mentioning.
Right, exactly.
Right. So, and the interruption in career building once female workers decide to have a family, that's another issue to address.
Indeed, and that actually is the cause behind this dualism structure here, because female workers here in Korea have often forced to leave the labor market when they have a family, marriage, children and all that. And they need to come back later on. They cannot come back to the first part of the labor market, which is well protected, well organized, and highly paid. So they usually go to the second part of the market, which is usually based on temporary arrangements. So that interruption in terms of career building itself needs to be addressed, and then that is one of the key agendas for the President Park herself, who is a female president here, to change the overall structure. But once again, I think the point that we want to close here, this discussion today, is that the situation is improving and we need to further speed up the overall improvement trend that we see here in Korea.
Right, the government has been trying to tackle this issue as well from various angles, from the welfare perspective, from jobs perspective. So we hope to see this more improvement, more speedier improvement in that front.
Absolutely.
All right, Dr. Kim Byung-kee, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
And that is your business today on this Tuesday. Thank you for watching. Do join us again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.